Hey everyone, Dean here. Today we are doing the last video in a 3-video series on how to use the HUD effectively, and in this video we're focusing on the turn and river, also known as the big money streets. These streets is where most of the money goes into the pot, and so these are the streets that are going to absolutely make or break your win rate. So making the correct decisions on these streets is arguably the most important thing you can do, and we really want to know how to utilize the HUD effectively in order to ensure that we're consistently making the right decisions. If you want to use the exact HUD that I use Nathan Williams Black Rain 79's full HUD, and there'll be a link to that HUD in the description below. You can also find the HUD on my Discord. This page has all the main HUD stats that we'll be using on the turn and river. Two of these stats stick out the most and are unlike the others, which is the aggression factor and winter showdown value. The reason why they're different is because we don't need a very large sample size in order to start relying on these stats effectively. The aggression factor is just a representation of how much our opponents bet and raise versus how much they just call. This is especially important for multi-tabling, and you don't really have time to delve deep into the pop-up menu to look up a bunch of different stats. You just kind of have to make a quick decision, and you can just refer to the aggression factor to see if your opponent's kind of more on the aggressive side or on the passive side. The winter showdown value, on the other hand, is really important because it pretty much tells you how often our opponent likes to call big bets on the turn and river that commit big portions of their stack. The more often they go to showdown, or the higher their winter showdown value, the more often they will call your big bets on the turn and river, and the lower the winter showdown value, the more often they won't call these bets. And so against the higher winter showdown value players, we need to tighten up, and against the lower winter showdown value players, we can bluff more. A couple more things I wanted to go over quickly on this page is that I've coupled a lot of the stats together. As you can see, C-bet turn and C-bet river are coupled together, and these are just the sample sizes relative to those stats. So you want to have at least 500 hands on an opponent to start reliably using the C-bet turn, and you want at least 1,000 hands on the opponent to reliably start using the C-bet river. And that's going to be a common problem when we are trying to formulate decisions on the turn and river, especially with very, very specific stats like C-bet turn and C-bet river. By the time we get to the turn and river, things usually get a little bit messy. And what I mean by that is that it's not always going to be a C-bet. It's not always going to be the pre-flop raiser, bet the flop, bet the turn, bet the river. It's usually going to be, the pre-flop raiser, bet the flop, check the turn, bet the river, or check the flop, bet the turn, bet the river, bet the flop, got raised on the flop, called, then let out on the turn. As you can see, things get very, very messy very, very quickly the further on we go into the hand. And that's why some of the more overall or all-encompassing stats like bet turn and bet river become increasingly important for two reasons. One, for the sample size issue, and two, for the fact that things tend to get messy, and we just want more of a general view of what our opponents tend to do on the big money streets, being the turn and river. So as you can see, we need less than half of the hands for a C-bet turn compared to bet turn in order to have a good idea of how often our opponent likes to be aggressive and bet out on the turn. Same is true for bet river. And this is going to just be a better representation until we get an incredibly large sample size on our opponents, which is only going to happen with a few regulars, of how our opponents like to play on these streets. The last thing I wanted to go over is just a little bit of terminology, since I'm not going to get into that later in the video, is a 2-bet is any first raise on the turn or river. So if somebody bets and somebody raises, the person who raises, that's going to be classified as a 2-bet by Poker Tracker and HUD software. And the other is a float. So when I say float, I'm not talking about calling. I'm talking about betting out once our opponent has checked to us. The first category is deciding whether or not to c-bet or just make a plain old bet. So when we're deciding to make a c-bet on the turn and river, it is important to see how often our opponent folds to a turn c-bet or a river c-bet. If there is a sample size issue, and more often than not there will be, we need to refer to how often they generally fold to a bet on the turn or river, which is something we can look up very quickly in the pop-up tab. Obviously, the more our opponents are folding, the more often we should be betting with our air and draws. And some opponents may usually call a turn bet, but often fold to a river bet. And so in those cases, we should be considering betting the turn with the intention of firing another barrel on the river in order to get them to fold. So we also always want to be checking how frequently our opponents raise our bets. So how often they 2-bet. If our opponent is 2-betting very frequently on the turn and river, we need to be protecting ourselves by checking more, especially with our marginal hands that cannot withstand a raise. So the last stat we should check, especially if the bet we are going to be making is going to commit a large portion of our stack, is just how often our opponent goes to showdown. A quick reference for that is a high went to showdown value is 30% or more. These are the absolute calling stations. We never want to try to bluff these people. We can exploit them simply just by betting for value, and they'll be calling us with plenty of nonsense. The more middling ground went to showdown value, and the more optimal number is about 23% to 25%. These people are going to the showdown an optimal amount of time. That being said, they certainly are capable of folding to a bluff if it is under the right conditions. And the people that have weak went to showdown values that are below optimal is about 22% or less. These people are absolutely allergic to going to showdown, and we should be bluffing them at every opportunity that we get. Our first example here is King 6 in the button. So folds over, and I raise. I'm going to go through these parts of the hand pretty quickly. I decide to c-bet. Alright, and now I'm going to decide if I want to c-bet again. So what I check is how often my opponent folds to turn c-bets, but we can see we only have 100 hands on the guy, so we're not going to get very relevant stats, especially out of only one opportunity. So we're going to open up the pop-up tab and just check how often our opponent folds to a bet in general. As we can see, our opponent folds to a bet on the turn 5 out of 5 times so far. So although it's not a huge sample by any means, we only have 160 hands, we only have 5 opportunities here, we can safely say that if we bet the turn, there's a really good chance that he's going to fold. Probably often enough that betting the turn here will be incredibly profitable. So he checks to us, and we decide to bet, and the fish calls, and we see a river card. The river is a pretty much complete brick. If anything, it's better for his range than it is for ours, but I don't want to talk about general strategy very much. I just want to talk about what I'm checking for the HUD stats. So now I'm going to be checking two things. How often this opponent goes to showdown. As we can see, over 160 hands, our opponent has went to showdown only 19% of the time. This is incredibly small and is something that we should be actively looking to exploit. The last thing I want to check is just how often our opponent folds on the river in general. The fact that he called the turn and he almost never calls the turn is certainly a little bit alarming. It could definitely mean he has a very strong hand, and we should definitely factor that into our decision. But when we check the river, we also see he is folded to a river bet 5 out of 5 times as well. So although we've been bluffing all the way through this hand, and none of these cards are good for us kind of from a general ABC poker sense, but because how often our opponent folds and his low went to showdown value, betting the river here is still going to be profitable. So bet, and I believe he folds. Yes, he does, and that's that. And this is exactly why we always want to take the time to check how often our opponents take certain actions on the turn and river using the pop-up tab. The next example we have is Ace 9 in middle position. So versus another huge fish, we have a limper, so we isolate, raise, we call, make top pair, bet for some value. He gives the call. So now we're going to make a decision whether or not we want to be betting this turn again. This is a fish who doesn't usually fold from our pretty small sample size, but doesn't usually fold on the turn. Only folds about 40% of the time to a turn bet if we open the pop-up tab. And our hand is a little vulnerable and doesn't necessarily a 3 streets of value hand, but against a fish it definitely could be. The thing I'm looking at here is our opponent raises about half the time, 42% of the time, which is unbelievably crazy. A high turn 2 bet would be about 20, and this guy has double that. So I don't really want to get raised with a hand like this. So I think ultimately we want to just be checking behind, even though we're still pretty happy with the strength of our hand. And hopefully if we get raised on the river, which I believe this opponent also does fairly frequently at 25% of the time, a little bit less of a sample size there, but that's okay, we can actually call a raise. Now if we bet here and then get raised and then face a river jam, we're really going to hate life. So overall, because how often our opponent is raising the turn, and with our particular hand, we just want to be checking back and controlling the size of the pot, and then making that bet on the river in order to extract some value, which I think he just calls. So, moving on. The next section focuses on what to do when our bet on the turn or the river gets raised. And first and foremost, just a disclaimer, when people raise you on the turn and river, we should be giving them the utmost respect. These are usually not going to be bluffs and are almost always just the nuts or close to it, especially on the river when people can't even semi-bluff. So only a few players, especially at the small and micro stakes, are either going to be creative enough to work in some bluffs into their raising range on the turn and river, or just be absolute maniacs who are bluffing with just about anything and just raising whenever they feel like. So that being said, it's really important to check how often our opponent raises a bet, how often they 2-bet for the specific street, the turn or river. This can always be found in our pop-up HUD, and the more frequently our opponent raises, the more marginal and in some rare cases even bluffs we need to start to work into our range. But again, we're going to need a pretty big sample size to know for sure that our opponent is running big bluffs against us. So we should always check our opponent's win to showdown value as well at this point. Again, if it's low, 25% or less, 20% or less, we can definitely start to contemplate running some huge bluffs if the pot isn't already super large by the time they make their first raise. So a couple examples that we have for this is we have pocket jacks here from under the gun, making a standard raise, getting called by 2 players, 1 decent looking recreational player, and 1, or I guess he's a bad reg, it's close between a bad reg and recreational, and a huge whale. So call, this is a good board for us with an overpair obviously, so we decide to bet. Villain 10 gets out of the way, and then we are here on the turn. I make a standard turn c-bet, thinking there's plenty of value to get from this guy. Doesn't fold to a turn c-bet very often. Doesn't fold to a turn bet very often in general. Don't have the hugest sample size on this stat. And our opponent decides to come in for the about 3x, 2.9x raise. So first thing we do when we check this, and we really should have already checked this before we even made this bet, is how often does our opponent 2-bet the turn? Our opponent 2-bets the turn only 5% of the time over 39 times. So this means he's really going to have pretty much just the nuts here. And although we do have an overpair, and sure there's plenty of semi-bluffs he could have, I guess, although we block both the flush draws, our opponent, more often than not at this point, is either just going to have a set or have some sort of strange straight or a 2-pair combination kind of thing, and we are gonna have to fold our overpairs. It doesn't matter if I have jacks, it doesn't matter if I had aces, we definitely have to fold at this point, because if we get this decision wrong and we keep making this mistake, it's gonna be incredibly hard for us to ever have a positive win rate over the long run. So that's what I do, just fold. The next example we have here is pocket kings in the cutoff. Raise it up, get a call from a big fish, make a standard c-bet. We can see our opponent isn't folding to turn c-bets very often. We have a pretty big sample size, so it's perfectly reasonable to start using the stat. And so we definitely want to be betting big here for value, even though this board's a little scary and there's plenty of two pair and set combinations out there. Our opponent just decides to call, and on the river, the board pairs, making it so that we even beat some hands like 7-9 or Queen-9. So I think betting here again is completely fine, especially with somebody who has a really high went to showdown value, and so betting for thin value is going to be more profitable. I decide to bet for 12, then our opponent comes in for the raise. Now we just want to check how often is our opponent raising on the river. His line might not make that much sense, but the fact that he's only raising on the river 6% of the time, 2 out of 35 times, makes me really think that he's not doing this with a hand that can't be a single pair. So I think ultimately we just want to be letting our hand go here. It's completely all right. This is not going to happen very often. And when people raise on the river, we really got to give them the respect that they deserve, and we just got to fold here, which is what we do. The next category focuses on what to do when we are facing a bet on the turn and river. So the most obvious thing to check when facing a turn and river bet is just how often our opponent bets on the turn and river. And we can do this generically in the pop-up tab by just seeing how often they bet any turn or bet any river. And once we get a large enough sample size on our opponent, we can start to check the specifics. Most importantly, their c-bet turn or c-bet river, if they are making a c-bet, or how often they donk or float, or all those different types of bet types. So another really important thing to consider is if our opponent's only going to be betting the turn frequently, but then slowing down a lot on the river, then we should be calling the turn more and even planning to float some rivers with air or marginal hands or bad draws and stuff like that. But if our opponent is the kind of person to barrel the turn and then always or almost always follow that bet up on the river, we need to start thinking if our hand can withstand 2 streets of betting. And if it can't, it's almost always better to fold on the turn and not call the turn bet and then fold to the river bet. Another important thing to consider is how likely our hand is to improve by the river. So obviously just kind of like a naked pocket pair is only going to have 2 outs to improve by the river. But something like a flush draw and a pair is going to have something like 15 outs, 12 outs, something like that to improve by the river. So ultimately, the more our opponent bets, the more marginal hands that we are going to need to defend with. In this example, we have Queen 10 offsuit in the cutoff, and we make a standard open raise. An absolute maniac, a 51-18-15 of a villain, decides to call us on the button, and we see a flop. Checking to the villain, letting him kind of hang himself, he decides to bet out. He's going to be betting the flop 71% of the time. We definitely have to call with third pair. And then he decides to lead out for pot on the turn after the board pairs. So the first thing we want to do is just check how often he's betting the turn. We can't check the c-bet stats because we're not going to have a reliable sample size, and he's not even making a c-bet. So the turn, he's betting a total of 83% of the time. And this is, although betting pot on the turn like this is definitely a sign of strength, and I don't usually recommend calling with third pair here, we really have to call just because how often he's betting and how wide his range can be. There's no way we're going to be able to get away from this hand yet. So because of that, I definitely recommend just calling on the turn here. All right, so moving on to the next example, we're going to have Ace-9 here in middle position. So we decide to make a fairly standard raise, and we get a call from the small blind and big blind. It checks to us with top pair, and we decide to make a standard c-bet. Folds to the absolute whale of an opponent in the big blind, and he decides to call. The turn, comes the king. Not a great card for us, especially because it completes the flush draw. But against an absolute whale, there's still some value to be had, I believe. So I decided to make a turn c-bet. Very questionable if this is the right play, but it's what happened. And so our opponent decides to call again. And now our opponent decides to donk into us for half pot on the river. Now, a lot of people get a little bit messed up by donks, and they think, oh man, he's only donking because this is the only chance he can win by getting us to fold. But in my experience, people who donk the river, they almost always have it, and they're just trying to make sure you don't check behind. So what we should do when our opponent decides to make a bet on the river, although we don't have a large sample size yet, we could definitely check how often our opponent just bets the river in general. And so we have 20 hands on our opponent at this time, 19 hands exactly, and he's only bet 2 out of 19 times. He's never donked before, although we have way too low of a sample size to really be considering that yet. But the fact that he almost never bets the river really makes me think that there's no way a one-pair hand would ever be good here. And because of that, we just fold. The last category we're going to be going over today is deciding to raise on the turn or river. And the main stat we want to be looking for in general when we're deciding to make a big bluff or a thin value raise on the turn or river is our opponent's went to showdown value. The lower our opponent's went to showdown value, the less likely they are to call or raise, so we should be going and try to add more bluffs and include less thin value. And conversely, the higher opponents went to showdown value, the more thin value that we can get and the less we need to be working in bluffs or possibly even semi-bluffs on the turn versus these opponents. If we do get a large enough sample size, which we almost never will, we also can consider how often our opponent folds to a 2-bet on the turn or a 2-bet on the river. So we're going to need probably around at least 1,000 hands for either of these, but once we do have a decent sample size, we can start using the stat fairly reliably, but we also want to be focusing on the went to showdown value as well. So again, the more often they fold to a 2-bet, the more bluffs and semi-bluffs they want to work into our range, and the more often they call a 2-bet, the more thin value we need to work into our range. So the example that we have here is King 10 suited in the big blind. Our pretty regular recreational kind of looking villain decides to raise on the cutoff, and we decide to make a fairly reasonable call from the big blind. We flop a flush draw, and our opponent decides to bet into us after we check to them, and we decide to call. So the turn comes the 3 of spades. Doesn't really help us at all. Doesn't really help him at all, most likely. We check to him, and our opponent decides to bet again. Another key factor to think about when our opponent is when we want to 2-bet our opponent is how often they're betting the turn and river. So we can see our opponent's betting the turn, or c-betting the turn about 42% of the time, and the turn in general only a small 21% of the time. So usually when he has the betting lead, he'll decide to bet again, but he's usually pretty passive in other situations. But the main thing I'm looking for here is how often our opponent folds to a 2-bet. We only have 3 samples on our opponent, and that's not enough to start to really rely on this and start bluff raising him with any 2 cards. But the fact that we do have a really solid semi-bluff, and there's a good chance a king or diamond is good, I think this is a good opportunity to put some pressure on our opponent and continue to kind of test the waters versus him by adding or throwing a semi-bluff into our range here. The last thing we want to check is his went to showdown value, which is a really high 30. So this is a good reason not to raise. So we have a little bit of conflicting information here, but the fact that our hand, just from basic ABC poker, plays pretty well as a semi-bluff here, I think we definitely can be working some raises into our range, just from the fact that our opponent seems to like to fold once his turn bet gets raised. So that's exactly what we do, and our opponent folds as we hoped. The next example we have is 7-6 offsuit from the button. So it folds around to us, and we decide to make a fairly standard open raise, and we get a call from the small blind, which is a pretty decent regular. We flop a gut shot, and this is a pretty good opportunity for us to bet. As we can see, he doesn't fold on the flop very often, but he folds on the turn at least one time. and he has a very low went to showdown value, folding on the turn about half the time. So we definitely can be betting here with the intention of betting again some more on some later streets. Our opponent calls, and that's pretty standard, or pretty expected, and the turn comes a 10 of hearts, better for our range than it is for his, almost certainly. So after he checks to us, we decide to keep to our guns and bet out again. He decides to call, and now he decides to donk the river. And as I said previously, people who donk usually have a pretty solid hand, and there definitely is not necessarily just like a misdraw or anything. But the fact that our opponent has a went to showdown value of 17% means this guy is pretty much allergic to showdowns. And because of that, we really want to be finding ways to exploit our opponent by putting him to the test by raising with a lot of bluffs and marginal hands. So we can check the river just to see if he's folded to a river 2-bet ever. He's never had the opportunity to fold to a river 2-bet, but the 5 out of 6 times that anyone's bet into him onto the river, he's folded, which is another good reason that we should possibly raise here. But the main factor, it being his really low went to showdown value, and we do have a fairly decent sample size to start using the stat reliably at 300 hands. I think this is a great opportunity to really bluff our opponent off of his most likely kind of like top pair holding and raise this river, which is what we do, and our opponent does make the fold. So that was the last example. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Really glad I could finally finish out this series. Hope you guys learned a lot from it. If you haven't seen the previous 2 videos, I definitely recommend them. They're really going to teach you how to use the HUD effectively and start exploiting your opponents to the absolute maximum. I'll be out with some new content soon, so definitely don't forget to subscribe. Make sure to like and comment. Give me as much feedback as you like. I hope you guys have a nice day.